The silent hammer blow landed at 4 a.m. Eastern Time, shaking the very foundations of diplomatic understanding. A colossal shadow was stretching across the Central American landscape, a physical manifestation of a seismic geopolitical shift. It wasn't steel bollards or virtual fences, but sheer, unyielding, 30-foot-high concrete, stretching into the dense jungle. Mexico, the long-standing partner and perennial subject of border security demands, was building its own massive wall. The sheer audacity of the role reversal, the ultimate twist in the North American security narrative, was immediately palpably stunning. A hush fell over the halls of Washington, D.C., a silence heavier than any political confrontation, preceding the inevitable chaotic storm of outrage. This was not a defense against the North. This colossal barrier faced south, slicing through the heart of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The jungle air, thick with humidity and the scent of unknown flowers, now mingled with the acrid dust of freshly mixed cement. Before you hear the rest of this unimaginable story and discover the truth behind Mexico's silent declaration of independence, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications. Tell us in the comments right now, what is the real reason Mexico would build a wall facing south? The first news alert landed on the desks of U.S. State Department officials like a heavy lead weight, instantly shattering the carefully crafted veneer of continental stability. It wasn't a rumor or a leak. It was an official, if cryptic, press release from the Mexican Ministry of National Defense, detailing Phase 1 of the Southern Sovereignty Project. The sheer-scale hundreds of miles of solid, reinforced concrete, designed for permanence, defied every established norm of bilateral cooperation and instantly rendered decades of American border rhetoric obsolete and strangely ironic. The White House press briefing room, usually a site of controlled chaos, descended into genuine pandemonium as reporters clamored for answers to the most immediate and confounding question. Are we certain this is Mexico building this wall? The spokesperson, pale and visibly rehearsed, could only offer non-committal phrases about consulting with Mexican counterparts and upholding regional security pacts. The underlying tension was electric. This action, while technically on Mexican sovereign territory, was a profound geopolitical insult and a direct challenge to the unspoken continental hierarchy that had governed North America for generations. Within hours, the U.S. Congress became a crucible of contradictory fury. Hardline Republicans, long champions of border walls, found themselves in the surreal position of condemning the very principle they had championed, labeling Mexico's move as hostile and unnecessary provocation. Democratic leaders, previously vocal critics of any physical barriers, were caught speechless, struggling to reconcile their humanitarian concerns with the sudden cessation of migrant flows arriving at the U.S. southern border, a short-term political victory wrapped in a profound diplomatic defeat, leaving them in a silent, stunned paralysis. This unexpected revelation immediately exposed the deep, structural dependency of the United States on Mexico acting as an external enforcement arm, a human dam holding back the powerful currents of Central and South American migration. For years, the U.S. had pressured, coerced, and even funded Mexican efforts to militarize its own southern border, using the deployment of the Mexican National Guard as a crucial buffer. The concrete wall was Mexico declaring, in the most physical and unmissable way possible, that the subcontracting arrangement was over. The enforcement was now purely internal, unilateral, and non-negotiable, sending shockwaves through every echelon of American security planning. The actual construction site, stretching from the Pacific coastline near Puerto Arista, across the vast, oppressive heat of the Chiapas jungles, and toward the dense forests of the Petén Basin near Guatemala, was a logistical nightmare and a feat of raw engineering. The wall, known internally as El Muro Maya, stood 30 feet tall, anchored in bedrock, its face slick and featureless, designed specifically to defy scaling or breaching. Heavy-duty Mexican Army Engineering Corps units worked 24 hours a day, bathed in the blinding white light of massive floodlights, transforming the ancient, sacred landscape into a scene of industrial, relentless modernity, driven by a nationalistic fervor unseen in decades. The challenge wasn't just the sheer volume of concrete and steel, but the formidable, nearly impenetrable terrain itself. Jungles, prone to torrential, unpredictable rains, required unprecedented drainage systems, while the rugged, volcanic foothills demanded deep, complex foundations to prevent slippage. Entire mountainsides had to be blasted and carved away, scouring the pristine environment, a process that employed tens of thousands of local workers under military supervision. The relentless, deafening noise of jackhammers and heavy machinery echoed across river valleys where, just months before, only the calls of exotic birds and the quiet whispers of migrants had been heard, marking a brutal and permanent change in the region's acoustic identity. For the vast communities of migrants who had long relied on the porous, winding pathways of the jungle and the treacherous crossings of the Suchayat River, the wall's presence was an instantaneous absolute catastrophe. The flow of human movement, once a slow, determined river, was instantly dammed and diverted, forcing desperate families into increasingly perilous cartel-controlled corridors far from the official construction zone, or trapping them in the border towns of Topachula and Wixla. These towns, already saturated with asylum seekers and lacking adequate infrastructure, became open-air detention centers, witnessing a rapid deterioration of sanitary and humanitarian conditions under the sudden and complete pressure of confinement. The humanitarian tragedy quickly escalated, becoming an almost unbearable sensory experience in the tropical heat. Reports emerged of migrant camps overflowing, lacking clean water, and facing severe medical shortages as local and international NGOs were blocked or overwhelmed by the Mexican military's strict security perimeter around the wall. The irony was not lost on critics. The construction, supposedly designed to bring order, had achieved the precise opposite, creating a massive, concentrated zone of human suffering. Yet now this crisis was contained solely within Mexico's borders, shielded by the concrete from the direct gaze of the northern superpower it was intended to placate. Mexico's decision was not one born of sudden impulse, but a calculated, desperate move rooted in a confluence of overwhelming internal security crises, political fatigue, and a strategic aspiration for true sovereignty. For years, Mexico's successive governments had been caught in an impossible bind, criticized by the U.S. for not doing enough to stop migration, yet simultaneously destabilized by the vast sums of U.S. aid and political leverage that came with that enforcement role. The true breaking point, however, was the escalating brazen power of the transnational organized crime talk groups, the cartels, which were increasingly using the Central Migration Corridor as a vast, lucrative human trafficking pipeline, undermining Mexican state control. The wall, therefore, was less about stopping migrants and more about definitively severing this key revenue stream for the cartels, a strategic move to starve them of the massive profits derived from moving people. The recent, alarming surge in U.S. political rhetoric, particularly the repeated inflammatory calls for direct military intervention on Mexican soil to dismantle these cartels, was the final trigger that propelled the Mexican administration toward this extreme measure. Building the wall was a preemptive physical act of national defense. By securing the southern border themselves, they could strip the U.S. of its primary pretext for intervention, the perceived failure of Mexico to control its own territory and reclaim the narrative of security. The domestic political situation was also reaching a boiling point, fueled by a deep-seated nationalism and a sense of victimization under U.S. pressure. The Mexican president, leveraging this national sentiment, framed the Southern Sovereignty Project as an act of dignified self-sufficiency, telling a shell-shocked nation that Mexico would no longer tolerate being treated as a patio trasero backyard or a mere security buffer for Washington's internal political debates. This message resonated profoundly with a population weary of being blamed for crises originating far south of their own border, transforming a defensive military operation into a celebrated, if environmentally devastating, symbol of national pride and an unexpected assertion of independence. This strategic choice was a dramatic gamble, a massive reallocation of national resources, billions of dollars redirected from social programs and infrastructure to the concrete barrier. However, the calculation was simple, yet brutal. The long-term cost of allowing the cartels to strengthen their grip via the human trafficking trade, coupled with the ever-present threat of a U.S.-led military strike against talk operations, was deemed far greater than the immediate expense and diplomatic friction caused by the wall. The silence of the southern frontier, secured by cold concrete, was intended to purchase Mexico the ultimate currency, sovereign control over its own fate and the ability to negotiate with Washington from a position of unexpected, steely strength. The implications for the wider hemisphere were immediate and severely destabilizing. Central American nations, particularly Guatemala and Honduras, found themselves completely isolated and facing an unprecedented humanitarian bottleneck as the migrant flow, now irreversibly cut off from its northern destination, backed up within their own borders. Diplomatic communication between Mexico City and Central American capitals froze instantly, replaced by a torrent of accusatory condemnations of Mexican betrayal and neo-imperialism. The economic and social structures of these smaller nations, already fragile, began to buckle under the impossible strain of caring for hundreds of thousands of suddenly stranded, desperate people, transforming the regional crisis from a northern problem into a strictly Mesoamerican nightmare. The complex tapestry of trade and economic cooperation under the USMCA agreement immediately frayed under the geopolitical strain, while the flow of goods and commodities continued. The political trust required for deep, meaningful cooperation evaporated. U.S. corporate interests, initially worried about supply chain disruptions, quickly became more concerned about the long-term political instability. The financial markets reacted with volatility, recognizing the wall not merely as a physical structure, but as a symbolic break in the economic and security alliance that had defined North American competitiveness. Washington now faced the difficult reality that its primary security partner had just executed a monumental act of independent self-interest, forcing a fundamental reassessment of the entire relationship. This radical shift in migration patterns created entirely new security concerns for the U.S., as desperate cartels, deprived of the human trafficking income stream, immediately pivoted to more volatile, higher-risk smuggling operations, focusing intensely on fentanyl and weapons. The wall forced these criminal networks to invent new, more violent routes, leading to a massive increase in maritime trafficking along the coasts and a surge in illicit air traffic, pushing the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to scramble and reallocate resources away from the now quiet land border to the much harder-to-monitor air and sea approaches, recognizing that the problem hadn't vanished, but had simply become weaponized and dispersed. Ultimately, the massive concrete sentinel in the South El Muro Maya did more than just stop the flow of people. It fundamentally rewrote the geopolitical script of the Americas. It was a clear, dramatic demonstration that the balance of power, long dictated by the priorities of the U.S. Capitol, had been unilaterally challenged and redefined by its southern neighbor. The stunned reaction in the United States was the realization that, by building its own wall, Mexico had simultaneously constructed a new foundation for its own sovereignty, forcing Washington to confront a new continental order, where its demands were no longer the only law of the land, permanently altering the texture and tone of diplomatic exchange for generations to come. The initial media frenzy surrounding the engineering marvel eventually gave way to a deeper, more philosophical reflection on the ethics of barriers and the nature of sovereignty itself. Journalists. Crossing the border into Mexico, a journey, now ironically simplified by the lack of northbound migrants, found themselves reporting on the bizarre spectacle of American citizens driving south to witness the completed sections of the monumental wall. They documented the strange quiet that had settled over the usually chaotic border crossings of Chiapas, replaced by the omnipresent, stern silence of the military patrols, a palpable sense of internal discipline contrasting sharply with the chaos the wall had unintentionally generated further south in Guatemala. The wall stood not just as a physical barrier but as a mirror, forcing the American public and political elite to confront the unintended consequences of their own decades of immigration policy and the constant pressure they had exerted on their neighbor. The very structure that Mexico had been criticized for not having on its northern border was now the ultimate symbol of its defiance on its southern frontier. This role reversal sparked uncomfortable national dialogue in the U.S., with pundits and political commentators debating whether Mexico had merely adopted the American solution to a shared hemispheric problem, or if it had deployed the ultimate strategic checkmate. Local communities on the Mexican side of the border, initially resistant to the construction, began to experience a strange, uneasy stability. While the humanitarian crisis remained, the pervasive, daily fear of cartel violence and the relentless stream of migrant traffic through their towns subsided. The presence of the military, though authoritarian, brought a certain kind of order that many had long yearned for, a security that was bought at the staggering price of isolation and the severance of historic cultural ties with their Central American neighbors. The jungle, once a pathway of hope, had become a graveyard of ambition, sealed off by the towering, unforgiving concrete. In Washington, the immediate priority shifted from condemning the wall to understanding its operational success and replicating its efficiency, a desperate, covert interest in the architectural and security blueprints of the Mexican structure. The intelligence community began compiling detailed reports on the wall's sophisticated sensor array, its drone surveillance patterns, and the logistical genius required to execute such a massive project in the challenging terrain. The ultimate irony was complete. The United States was now seeking to learn from, and potentially borrow, the border security technologies developed by the very nation it had historically dominated on the issue, transforming a former vassal into an unlikely, if reluctant, expert in massive terrestrial separation. The diplomatic repercussions continued to unfold, moving beyond initial shock into a phase of grudging acceptance and complex negotiation. High-level meetings between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Mexican Foreign Minister became tense. Sterile affairs, focused not on demanding the wall's removal, a universally understood impossibility, but on mitigating its fallout, particularly the humanitarian crisis backing up into Central America, a new and dangerous source of instability. Mexico's position was simple and unyielding. The security of the North was now an internal Mexican affair, and the resulting problems to the South were a shared hemispheric challenge, demanding new, massive aid packages for the Central American nations that had not yet materialized. This strategic redefinition of the crisis created a vacuum of leadership, which China and Russia were swift to exploit, offering immediate aid and infrastructure loans to Guatemala and Honduras under the guise of humanitarian assistance. But with clear geopolitical strings attached, Washington watched with growing alarm as its traditional spheres of influence began to erode. Realizing that Mexico's unilateral wall had done more than just secure its own borders, it had opened up a critical flank in the global struggle for influence, forcing the U.S. to choose between supporting Mexico's controversial action or allowing rival global powers to gain a foothold deep within its hemisphere. The concrete structure was rapidly proving to be the most impactful geopolitical event of the decade. The economic consequences also began to clarify, highlighting the unexpected financial burden placed on U.S. businesses that relied on the fluidity of the Mexico-Guatemala border for specialized high-value supply chains. While the overall USMCA trade remained robust, specific industries, particularly agriculture and niche manufacturing in the northern states of Central America, faced total collapse. This forced the U.S. to indirectly engage with Mexico's terms, offering specialized financial aid and investment into the very communities the wall had isolated, recognizing that regional economic collapse was a far greater long-term security threat than the wall itself. A complex and bitter pill for Washington to swallow. The enduring silence of the jungle border, now interrupted only by the distant hum of generators and the rhythmic clicking of patrol boots, became a metaphor for the new North American reality, a relationship defined by separation, self-interest, and a grudging, highly conditional respect. The U.S. was stunned not just by the sight of the concrete, but by the dawning realization that Mexico had finally learned to play the great power game, using the most dramatic symbol of exclusion as its ultimate tool for inclusion in the global political stage. The world watched, breath held, as the new walled geography settled in, a permanent scar on the face of the continent, signaling the end of one era and the uncertain, heavily fortified beginning of another. The detailed planning behind the wall, known as Operation Cierre, revealed a level of internal secrecy and coordination within the Mexican military and the executive branch that amazed U.S. intelligence analysts. It involved months of covert land acquisition, pre-staging of colossal construction modules, and the synchronized deployment of the Mexican National Guard and Army Corps of Engineers under the cloak of routine security drills. The fact that an operation of this immense scale, involving thousands of personnel and tons of material, was executed with zero leaks and a unified political front spoke volumes about the new, hardened resolve of the Mexican state, a state that was tired of being publicly chastised for its inability to control its own destiny.